Trade compliance and culture. If you're not having a culture as an aspect in your trade compliance work, I really encourage you to do so. For example, if you're doing business as a person that's part of another culture, to acknowledge that culture will really enhance their acceptance of your regulations. For example, if you are showing that person that you are acknowledging their culture and where and what they are coming from, they will gain a higher level of acceptance for your regulations that they may need to follow when doing businesses with you. But I am not the one to tell you all the details about culture as an aspect to your trade compliance work, because I have had the benefit of talking to Mr. Richard Loomans on the topic culture as a part of trade compliance. So, with no further ado, please enjoy Richard's insights on the cultural aspect of trade compliance.
Trade Compliance Talks with the Trade Compliance Podcast.
So, hello, Richard, and thank you for joining me in this really interesting topic of trade compliance out of a cultural perspective. And this is going to be a ton of value. I am looking very much forward to be enlightened within this topic. So, thank you once again for coming aboard. And please introduce yourself.
First of all, thanks for inviting me. Hi, everyone. My name is Richard Loomans. I am an international trade consultant. Been in the business for more than 20 years. And today we are going to talk about cultural factors in international trade compliance. And that's from a perspective from a practitioner. So from personal experiences, not from a research perspective or from a other perspective, but just from, what have I noticed the past few years and what could impact the level of compliance within a company.
But first, I have one question that I really like to hear from everyone that I talk with. How did you end up in trade compliance?
How did I end up in trade compliance? It came quite naturally for me. I've been interested in compliance and trade itself, international trade since childhood, basically. And I always wanted to know, what is trade? What is international trade? And what kind of rules do we need to comply with? But during studies, I did this feel, I need more about that one. So I started working with several companies and see, what is happening there? What kind of rules are there? So you see trade at the border, trade going on back and forth, people checking luggages, that you see traders going back and forth. So I always was interested as a young kid already, what is happening there? Well, I want to understand. So it's trade compliance came, I would not call it a dream, but it was I was curious about it. And the curiosity extended more and more while working at companies. The first question for me is always, what is regarded as trade compliance? Because that's the first and kind of an introduction in this talk as well. Because there's already a cultural factor in this. So, Anders, if I would ask you, what would you regard as trade compliance?
Trade compliance for me is, put simply, the regulation that you need to follow to ensure that you are doing businesses in a safe manner, and not safe for you per se, but safe in that regard that not all technology is for all hands.
So
that's my short definition.
Yeah, but trade compliance across borders, right? Not just within a company or within a country.
Trade compliance across borders is for me taking both your own legislation into consideration, but also the recipient's legislations into consideration.
Exactly. So that's already a great definition on that one, where already some cultural differences are impacted. Because trade compliance, from a cultural perspective, is it's trading internationally. So crossing borders, trade between two countries, trade between company A and company B in different countries, and the rules and regulations in order to do that. So indeed, as you said, you have to comply with the rules within the company to do that, and also on the other side, on the rules crossing the border. The most important part of that one is, and what you said, will comply also with the recipients. Do you think that it would be in every company, in every country, the same?
No, I would assume that it's different.
Yeah, because the part from the recipient part. So the rules on there is different from an EU perspective, for example. Take that into account than from a US. So there you have already a difference in how to proceed. Take you with the audience and everyone with us. An example: if you both are part of the ICPA, right?
Mhm.
So the compliance professionals. If you see the questions coming in there, it's always, and the answers is always looking into it from a US perspective or from EU perspective, but only one-sided from the perspective from the exporting country. There's never an answer looking into it from the recipient or the importer side. If you say that you take trade compliance, you take both sides into account, you would also expect to see both sides, right?
Mhm.
To see, okay, these are the rules from the exporting country, and these are the rules from the importing country, and you have to comply with these rules. In practice, we almost never see that when answering questions. We always look at from our perspective, from the exporting side. Or if we are the recipient, we look at it from our side. What are the import regulations? What are the import tariffs? What's the country of origin determination from our side? It's not from the exporting side. And most people within the business do not regard that one. But indeed, from trade compliance point of view, you should take into account both sides. So my perspective on trade compliance, and more specifically on international trade compliance, is comply with the rules of international trade within a customs perspective, export controls, trade policy. It's a much broader perspective. If I would ask that from, for example, I don't know if there are people in the audience coming from the US. They have the requirement to work within trade compliance to have the licensed custom broker. We in the EU don't have that. We have a training, you can follow training, but it's not a licensed one. You also, so that there is already a difference. Also, there's not in the US, a licensed trade compliance specialist. It's just a licensed custom broker. And if there are people working in compliance, they mostly are people with a legal background.
Yes. Yes, that's true.
So that's already also a difference in how to look at the wording itself. So within the cultural factors, within international trade, within trade compliance, is in the language use, the wording, the meaning, the way of making decisions, and the reasoning. So there are already, in a few minutes, you already see that there are some differences in perspective. How do you see trade compliance?
In first glance, that question can look very simple to answer, but
Yeah,
I think that when you are doing trade compliance and adding culture as an aspect to your trade compliance, that is like switching to advanced mode.
yeah, it is.
Because then you really need to know your customer, not only who your customer is, but in which environment and how do your customer do business, and what culture do they come from. And
Yeah,
I think that doing so would give the recipient really a bigger acceptance of your regulation when it lands in their hands.
exactly. And even not only from the recipient part, but also within the country itself, because you could also be dealing with people within your own team on trade compliance who are coming from different cultures, and they can have a different meaning to the different parts of trade compliance.
Yeah, of course. That's a interesting aspect of it as well. If you have people from different cultures in house, so to say.
Yeah. So it's a topic which is really important to understand, and even to be able to comply with the rules. Because if you don't take that factor into account, how can you fully comply with the rules? You're only to see it then from your own perspective, not from the other side. So it could be that you have a licensed custom broker within the US, for example, who has done the training but comes from a completely different culture, different cultural background. So we could have a completely different understanding on what is expected from it. So he maybe follows the rules, he maybe can read the rules, can read the regulation, but he can have a different meaning on the wording what's in the regulation, which could also result in a different outcome. For example, Anders, if I would ask you to, and the audience as well, to classify, for example, a tape, just a tape, with an adhesive tape, just as a tape. If I would ask you to describe a tape and then classify it.
It's some kind of adhesive, as you say, but I wouldn't classify it. I wouldn't give it a trade compliance export control classification. But of
Mhm.
course, this has a customs code.
Yeah, yeah. That's another one. Customs code classification. What's the terminology on classification? So you can have a classification in tariff from a EU perspective. You can have a classification or commodity code in some cultures. It's called commodity code from an export
Hmm.
control point of view. But if it is an adhesive, if you would talk to a chemist, it would also be a classification from that point of view. So
Mm.
the wording classification already is something that's already has a cultural factor in it.
See.
Who you're asking it is already impacting what the result will be. So I had a discussion a month ago, I guess, with a person who said, and I was talking about him with on classification and on HS code. And he said, please do not call it a classification because it's from a chemical point of view, a different one. So that already was a way of thinking, oh, okay, so I have to call it a different way, a different wording to use that to explain what I meant with the classification of this. But if you would do that, if you would ask that within the Netherlands or in Belgium, and you would use the phrase of classification, they would know, oh, and in your title, it's customs, they know, oh, you mean a custom tariff. So the wording itself can have a different meaning depending on who is asking. And as trade compliance specialists or as trade compliance as professionals, we are in group from a cultural perspective. And so if we would talk to each other on, okay, can you provide a customs code or custom classification? You would know what I mean.
Yeah, of course, it's our language.
Yeah. But if you would talk to a chemist, it could have a completely different meaning,
Yeah,
or
because
even to a engineer,
yeah,
because a customs could also be, oh, do you mean customs made? So it's a different kind of language in a way. So even if you are working within a company, the language used already has some factors in it. So to manage that, you have to manage expectations. What are you asking? What are you requesting from him or from her, to make that
yeah,
already clear?
I see some real communication challenges here that you really need to think of who you're talking to because, like you're saying, classification can mean many things, and a chemist may think of classification as how different materials interact with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, coming back to the tape, for example, the tape, if I were to describe it as a tape which has a liner, which has an adhesive part and has a carrier, for me, that's a tape. I learned
Mhm.
that from an engineer. Other people say, okay, I have a carrier and I have some adhesive, and that's why it is a tape. Okay, then we have another one. What's seen as a carrier? Is it the first layer, the second layer, the third layer of a tape? Even
Hmm.
if you have it's also called a tape, if you have a liner and an adhesive and a liner, it's also a tape. But from a classification point of view, it's an adhesive. Of course, the liners are seen as packaging. But to get that across and to understand, to discuss that with someone who just sees as a tape, or even a customs officer who sees in the description, because a lot of, in fact, companies or the countries just use the description on tape. But what's a tape? Even we're both from a generation that tape could also have a different meaning, like for example a cassette, or it's really have a different perspective. So
Yeah, really.
it's if you use really a general description, you can have a different result. So you have to take into account who are you talking to.
Yes, because if you ask a musician for a tape, you might get something else than you're expecting.
Yeah, exactly. Also another one, and that's from a researcher who has done that. What's your meaning? Just have a quick wording on that one as well, because it really makes clear what I mean by that is, if I would say to you, and we're talking about hockey, what's your meaning of hockey?
It's entertaining sport.
Hmm. But what kind of hockey do you mean?
Ah, I see where you're going there. Yeah, the hockey played on ice with a stick and a puck.
Yeah. So that's American, Canadian perspective, because
Yeah,
it's ice hockey, but they never call it ice hockey. They just say hockey.
yeah, right.
For us, hockey is playing on the grass or a gravel and with a ball and try to make goals.
Yeah, exactly.
So just one wording, it can already have different meaning. Even the let's take for example, we have one word for it in the Netherlands, in Dutch, and but has different wording in English language. Like for example, authorization, permit, license. But we have only one wording in the Dutch. But I've had some conversation with that one, and I had to translate that to English to make it clear. But I was at that point already was struggling. Okay, what's the correct phrase for this to use to make it clear? So wording and language is one of it that's really important to see already the cultural differences and the cultural factors in international trade and trade compliance. Of course, different wording, different meaning could have different results.
Yeah, and it could give you a totally wrong answer
Yeah.
in the end.
So did you ever think about that one?
I'm pretty sure that I have neglected that part, but one thing is for sure, I will never look at a tape the same way as before.
Yeah. Good to know.
And if we're taking the cultural aspect of trade compliance when you're negotiating a deal or something like that.
It has a meaning, but even also in negotiations, you have the same language barrier. It's the same. It's the same. Could have a different meaning. For example, there's a famous example to be mentioned is that American company and a Japanese company were trading on chips, so ICs, right? So you can have a 2% that can have some failures, errors. We allowed that. And so from the 100%, we allowed that 2% within manufacturers, it's not working. That's from the US perspective, that was okay. That's fine by us. We allowed that. Just that within manufacturing, it can happen. Not 100% will be done fine. We allow a failure of a percentage of 2%. So what they, and then the first shipment, what they were expecting was then the correct ones. So everything was correctly manufactured, everything was fine and was working. Oh, what happened in the shipment is that they received the full shipment, but also the 2% which went wrong. And the Japanese said, you were asking for it, so they did plus instead of. So they created, and the US company said, what will we do with this?
Oh. So
So,
they they
so
had
it's a funny example, but it shows what's happening there. So there's a language barrier. So in negotiation a deal,
Mhm.
it also and it means that you have to create the expectation that they are in line. That you can talk about it and that the message comes across.
So what I'm thinking there, did they deliberately manufacture 2% wrong so that they
Yeah,
could fulfill
yeah,
the
exactly.
contractual demand?
Yeah, exactly.
It's quite funny actually because they wouldn't have had any faulty items shipped if they hadn't had that in the contract.
Yeah, just that was accepted. It
Mhm.
meant for them, okay, oh, we can also ship them.
Oh, it's mandatory.
Yeah.
We need to break something before we ship them.
So
Mm.
it's one example on how things can go. They will not necessarily go wrong. There's a bit different perspectives on this.
Yeah, yeah, because they didn't expect that to be shipped to them.
Yeah,
I I assume.
yeah. So that's also in negotiation itself. So if you are if you're dealing with, for example, the Asian culture, there is a hierarchy. Okay, who is speaking? So you have to invite the project manager has to invite the next one in line. Within that, then
Mm.
the lower level trade compliance specialist is not allowed to speak up at that point. His management has to invite him, basically, to give to allow him to give his view.
All
But that's
right.
also the same with negotiations. In Asian cultures, the negotiations need to be on a certain similar level. They will not accept if the negotiation partner is from a what they see as a lower level. So
More like a turn taking.
yeah,
All right. It's quite different from how we do things. I'm guessing
yeah,
whoever has something to say most of the times just speak out loud when they feel for it,
yeah.
basically.
And they also can keep, if they are part of a presentation, they also can keep quite quiet until they are invited. If you are the project manager, for example, and one of your employees is from an Asian country culture, he will wait until you say, okay, okay, now for you to speak up, to explain your things.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have
No,
expressed their opinion, for example.
they will have an opinion, but they will not express it.
No, no, okay. But how would they perceive us when we are like interrupting and talking out loud and such? Do they get offended or how do they often react?
Yeah, they will not see you as very polite.
No, of course.
Because they have more a polite way to address things.
Hmm. Yeah.
There's a higher hierarchy level, right? So they want to they don't want to lose face. They respect have a high respect for a higher ranking.
Hmm.
If you would then chat in between, even laugh, they would not regard that as polite. So they would even ignore you or even leave the room. That
Yeah, that's interesting. That really put another level of importance to take the cultural aspect into consideration in your trade compliance work.
yeah, everyone, at least I do, but I guess also you do, that you work with multicultural teams,
Hmm.
right? That you ask questions within a team to get things done and to comply with the rules. So take that into account that if you work with different cultures, they have different perspectives. And you could also, if you can test that, if you would say, I expect a certain result from you, and I expect this tomorrow to
Hmm.
see their reaction on how they will do it. Or even
Okay.
if you would get a reaction, because it could also be that they do not agree with you, but they don't say it.
Okay. And how would that pan out, do you think? If they're not agreeing with my way of doing things, would they tell me or would they
No,
just ignore my
they will
request?
they would do it their way, but they will ignore you in a sense that they will not speak up. They will do whatever
Mhm.
is told, but there could be a completely different opinion.
Okay.
So we never get the real results in that sense.
No, exactly. I would have offended them, and then they would not be cooperative.
Yeah. When they answer with yes, it doesn't always mean that they mean yes.
No, they just have understood what I meant, but that could be on a negative note.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see.
So that's also important within our line of work, that we manage that expectation as well
Hmm.
to get the
Yes.
best results and to comply with.
Yeah, of course. What would you describe is the most important to have in mind when you're taking decision-making processes? What would you say is the most key ingredient in taking decisions that affects trade compliance over cross cultures?
To take into account the level of reasoning between different cultures. Because if we can have a quick we can maybe even have a quick decision on this. Okay, we have seen it, we've done our research. Doesn't mean that we have it in depth, but we have done the research and we make a decision. Other cultures can have a different approach. I've personal experience with that one. It's working with people from the US who had a kind of reasoning that they want to have the best approach, but the quick approach. We want to have it done tomorrow. And from my perspective, was okay, but I need to know this to follow my reasoning before I make a decision to whether or not we can comply with that. So there's a different way of reasoning to get to the same results.
So, would you describe making cross-cultural decisions like they would benefit of a slower paced decision making?
Depends on which cultures you're working with. So you first have to be aware of who are you working with, what's their approach of reasoning, manage expectations, and then look at the outcome to make room to make that decision. Because if you do not take that into account, then you maybe have had a decision making process, but it could be that not everyone is on board or even fully understand the decision that's made.
That could be a real danger if everyone is not on board with that a decision has been taken.
Yeah. So that's also again one within trade compliance, really important to get everyone on board. I can only assure compliance if everyone is on board.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because you really need to ensure that the whole chain of compliance is intact.
That's why compliance is also teamwork, right? It's not on one person. You have to check with different departments. You have to check with different people to ensure compliance.
Yes, of course, it always is. Should we move on to the customs part?
Yeah.
Could you briefly describe then how cultural differences affect the customs audit process?
Oh, it really does. The first thing again was on the language. So I had some experience working for a multinational who had wanted to, and the customs audits was based on the HS classification in Germany. They wanted to check, okay, if every import declaration was done perfectly, and they wanted to check the HS classification whether it was correctly done. They ask, of course, for information on this because they want to check. But
Hmm.
all the information was in English. This, to have a good understanding of the product, we would like to have the information in German
Yeah, of course.
because there could be a difference in interpretation.
Hmm.
So that was for me already the first sign. Oh, okay. Even if you would speak the English language or even could read, to have a good understanding, you want to have it in your own language. And the same happened again in France. They also want to have it in their language. To have a good understanding on what the product was, what the rules were, what the procedures was. Also, an important one is if you would have a customs audit in, for example, the Netherlands, they will ask for procedures on how the ways are done, but they will not go in depth as they would do in Germany. They're really on the procedures. Everything needs to be documented. Everything needs to be written out to have a full understanding.
Mm.
So there you already see some differences. Also, in our country, my country, the Netherlands, and in your country, we look for consensus. We can find a way to agree on things and move on. In different countries, they look at it from this perspective. They say the rules are this, and we have to follow this. If you do not comply with this one, you have some time, but you have to follow this. You have to comply with this. The rules are rules. It's not on, okay, we agree on this one and you have some time to correct it. No, in some countries, this rules are rules and you have to comply with it. Otherwise,
Mhm.
we cannot approve. So there already, in this sense, you already see a difference on how it is approached.
Yeah, because as I understand it, in some countries, it can be okay with just having that you have a strong and robust process. It would be good enough. But in another country, you really need to follow the regulations step by step and have the
Yeah.
documentation and proof that you really did and are doing.
Yeah. Oh, there's also where cultural factors come in, because you can work with several people within a group, within the same group, who has to do the reviews for the audit, support them, and they can have different views on this one. For someone from Germany, for example, would have a documentation really outlined every rule, but someone from another country, it would be okay. I've done this. This is how I came to the conclusion, and that's it. So even within a company, you can have different approaches, which could result in different results in doing a customs audit. Even the communication with a customs auditor could have some difficulties. They prefer, if you're part of a customs audit team, working as a contact person for the customs auditor from the customs officer,
Mhm.
they prefer to have it done in their own language, so in German. If you would do that in from a multinational who has a English speaking contact person, he would have done some troubles to get his message across. Of course, there could be a different understanding, because for the Germans, English is not their first language.
No, and it makes sense because the auditor needs to get into the details, and you don't want to have lost in translation to be a factor in that
Yeah,
regard.
yeah. So if they have no full understanding, they take their approach, and it could result into something completely different than you had in mind.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It makes a lot of sense, but I think it's easy to miss out on that one.
Yeah, it are really practical examples what we're discussing, others, but it's something really to think about on who do you work with, who is your contact, who are you negotiating with, and from which culture they're coming from. So not only from a national culture, so with a country where they are born, raised, or where they have their experience, but also the organizational culture part. Okay, how's the organization structured, and what's the background of that contact person? As again, we as trade compliance, we are an in group, but Kimes is not in that group, in the in group, so he's an outsider
No, yeah, of course.
who has a different understanding from our language than we do.
Yeah, and
So
sometimes a word can be in different languages. It could be perceived as a opposite of what you're actually asking for. And would you believe that out of a cultural perspective, the
mhm,
communication challenges in customs audit are similar to the communication challenges when doing businesses, or is it more important out of a customs audit perspective that you really listens into for example, the auditor, how they want to have things presented for them?
it's on a similar level. But if you're doing business with each other and with your business partner, you can they're still allowed to negotiate and to manage expectation at a later point. If you are in customs audits, wrong expectations, wrong communication, or wrong understanding of communication could result in a different results, could have consequences.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Makes a lot of sense because if the auditor doesn't understand you, he can make a wrong assessment of how you are
Yeah,
doing business and maybe a disregard of your way of doing things.
exactly.
Yeah, of course. And how could you mitigate these cultural risks and ensure that you're doing what you can to comply with the customs regulations?
First, manage the expectations. Get into a dialogue with each other. Know who are you dealing with, because it's to mitigate that risk of misunderstanding, making assumptions. Is not risk mitigation. So it increases the risk that something will go going wrong. So you have to to have awareness of the cultural differences. You have to also be trained by it to have that understanding before going any step further. Because it's one of the points that where it can go wrong. So it should be part of your risk mitigation process to make sure that you have a really good understanding who you're dealing with.
And if we play with the thought that I have a small company that's being audited from say the German customs,
Mhm.
how would you recommend that I do my homework, so to say? Could I contact the customs auditor and have a conversation to learn about how they want to have the information presented?
They look at it from their perspective. It would be best to have a person who has knowledge of the German language to contact the customer. Okay, what are your expectations? So that you have that you level on the language part. So I'm not sure if you speak the German language, but if you would contact them in your own language or in English, they will say, okay, make sure you have someone who knows our culture, who knows our language, and then we can discuss further.
Okay, so that would be a request from their side.
Yeah, because they want
Oh,
to have a good understanding.
interesting.
It's very important that the rules are followed. So they will support you. They will provide you some information, but it could
Hmm.
be that they have a different understanding of your question. Because again,
Yeah.
for most Germans, I'm not saying for all, but for most German, it's the English is not their first language. They want to
No,
have it
no,
in a German language. And
no, of course.
In the German language, some words have a different meaning.
Yeah, sometimes, as we have been into before during our talks, a word can have an opposite meaning in another language, although you think that you are on the same level.
Yeah.
I'm looking at my sheet notes here, and I think we have skimmed across all of my bullets. You have anything that you think could add to those?
Because but the one thing we did not came across about is how would the audience become aware of it, really, and learn about it, and to get that intercultural competence basically for themselves to work with that. And that's something that I just want to say, if they want to know more about that one, and it's more to say they can contact me directly and I will have some conversation on this one to create more awareness. So I think I understood that we can also do some one-on-one, or that we can invite audience to have some questions. I'm not sure if there already are some questions coming up, but we can answer them even one-on-one or in a personal message, or that we host a kind of a webinar.
If you have any questions to Richard regarding uh, trade compliance out of a cultural perspective, there is still a few minutes left. So if you have any questions, just add them to the comment section on the LinkedIn Live event, and I am sure that Richard will approach them.
Yeah. And even if they come up after this session, they can still approach me and send me a message or under the
Yeah,
comments, and then I will read the comments and answer them.
it's a new perspective of
Mhm.
trade compliance, but I think it's a really important one, and I will for sure take the cultural aspect into bigger consideration when I do my everyday work. I think it's a really important. If you're, for example, doing business across different cultures, then to have the other part, the recipient, to feel that you are acknowledging them, you're seeing them and their culture, I think that would really give a higher level of acceptance to what they need to do out of your regulatory perspective.
Yeah, exactly. For me, it was at least a good way to share it and to create some awareness of it, because it's, as said, it's something that's mostly completely forgotten within our world, that there are some differences in how to approach things.
And I think that thinking out of a cultural perspective really will make me a better trade compliance professional.
Mhm.
I'm just saying thank you very much, Richard, for enlightening me and every one of the listeners. I
Mhm.
think this will provide really great value to everyone. And I encourage everyone as well, take cultural as a new layer of your trade compliance if you're not
Yeah.
already doing it.
Yeah.
And also encourage everyone to reach out to Richard to have discussion on the topic. I think that you will be very rewarded.
Yeah. And I'm happy to support there.
Yeah, that's awesome. I guess it's time to say thank you, Richard. It was a
You're
real
welcome.
pleasure talking to you, and I'm really looking forward to the next time.
Okay. Me too.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, and have a really good day and stay safe and take care. And
Yeah.
we'll
You
speak
too.
again soon.
I'll speak to you soon. Okay.
Yeah. Bye bye.
Yeah. Bye bye.